So with that, we're going to turn to our next session, which is incubating innovation, the best practices for reciprocity and sandboxes with a cross-border focus. And to do that, we've got Wijetka Marone, who's director at the Bank of Thailand, and Carrie Suen from Ant International, moderated by Nelixa Devlukia, who's the UK ambassador for EPA. So over to you, Nelixa.
Conan, thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for this panel. I have with me, as Conan said, Wijetka Marone, who is the director of the FinTech office at the Bank of Thailand, and Carrie Suen, who is a senior advisor for global affairs and sustainable strategies at Ant International. And we're going to share some thoughts with you about regulatory sandboxes, some thinking around the cross-border arena, and in particular focus on cross-border payments, and also to touch upon the issue of next steps for regulatory sandboxes as well. I'm sure that you're all aware that regulatory sandboxes have been in the regulatory agenda now for a number of years, and there are various countries and organizations across the globe that have some version of a regulatory sandbox. There are differences in who can participate in regulatory sandboxes. Some are for banks only, some are for banks, some are for non-bank firms as well, some are for unregulated firms. So there's quite a lot of diversity in this sector. They often have a different focus. They will often have programs where they want people and firms to come into a sandbox to test certain technologies or to validate certain challenges that are posed. We've seen regulatory sandboxes look at data for sustainable finance. We see also that more and more jurisdictions have a regulatory sandbox or are thinking of a regulatory sandbox. And it's really interesting right now to have this conversation on the cross-border benefits of regulatory sandboxes. And with that, I'm going to invite Wijetka to actually talk to us about the Bank of Thailand's experience with a regulatory sandbox. So Wijetka, over to you.
Yes, Alisa, thank you so much for having me today. I'm truly honored to be part of the panel. So the regulatory sandbox experiences for the Bank of Thailand, we had it since 2016. It's basically not much different from the approaches of other regulators. Basically, the experimental framework, for innovations or financial service providers, which leverage new technologies with accommodative regulations under the limited scope of operation. And most importantly is that they are adopting with the real customers. So the question comes in, why did we choose the sandbox approach? Because there are the developments of the new technologies and emerging ones, which we don't really know how it works, especially in the financial services, right? So being and also the new business models for the providers have been introduced as well. So as being a regulator, we are playing an important role of being a facilitator as well to foster the innovation, to have help build the open and interoperable infrastructure for the financial services. So, and there's a statement always say that regulations kill innovations. So I think the regulatory sandbox will come in to be the playground for the service providers and also the regulators to learn together and share the development and understand what how it works and also the associated risks. So actually the three main objectives that we want to focus on is to promote innovations. Secondly is to maintain the level of acceptance level of risk. And last but not least here is to do the appropriate consumer protection. So I'll stop here and I'll come back later for some of the experiences.
Thank you very much. Could you just, Vijay, share with us who is able to actually participate in your regulatory sandbox, and has that changed over time?
Yeah, for the past 7 or 8 years that we've had it, we could say that there've been 3 generations of our regulatory sandbox. The first one was the pure regulatory sandbox, which opened up for only the regulated activities. Okay. Therefore, we only saw the regulated entities being able to enter into the sandbox. And I could tell that the sandbox for the regulator is very labor intensive for us as well, because once there are a lot of participants, it's kind of like people tease that it's not really the sandbox, it's the sand block, because it sometimes took so long to get into it, the application processes, and also the projects actually stayed in the sandbox quite a number of period of time. So that's the experience that we see. So the next generation of sandbox, we extinguished between the infrastructure. Only the one that you need to, test together with the other service providers, and only the projects that is considered to be the common infrastructure that you need to test together and also set the standardization will be in the regulatory sandbox. But still, only the regulated activities can enter in, because from our regulatory framework that we have, we don't have the specific regulations govern the sandbox itself. So it's just a guideline for the in Thailand financial sector of having the regulatory sandbox here. So we can't really waive any of the existing regulations, because all the regulations has to be compliant with first. So as you can see that it's quite limited for only the regulated entities, only regulated activities, and also they all have to be compliant with all the regulations. So what's the point of having a sandbox? Well, having it as the ground setting for the infrastructure works quite well for that approach, right? So that's why lately in this year, we expanded the scope of the regulatory sandbox, so-called enhanced regulatory sandbox, to allow the unregulated activities to test in the sandbox as well. But as I said, that is quite labor intensive, and we want to focus on the benefits and risk. That's why for the enhanced regulatory sandbox, we come up with the thematic approach. So the first thematic approach that we set up is the programmable payments, or you could say that it's the Thai baht reference stablecoin to be testing in the enhanced sandbox here. So currently we don't have the regulation for those. That's why we're saying that, okay, these are all unregulated activities that can test in our new scheme of sandbox nowadays.
Thank you very much. And it's interesting to see how your sandbox has evolved over time with the market. Kerry, let me bring you in, because obviously Ant International has a global outlook. I'm sure it's seen regulatory sandboxes in many jurisdictions. So please share with us your thoughts, primarily on the concept of regulatory sandboxes. And then also I understand that Ant has some experience of participating in regulatory sandboxes as well.
Yeah, so I want to just set the scene and then why regulatory sandbox could be an enabler in the increasingly complex web of regulatory requirements we see these days. I think payments has increasingly become regulated, and then I think then it comes to the question of accessibility. When the space is overly regulated, in certain ways there is implication where it becomes very costly to operate a regulated business, even though some of these players are trying to bring innovations into the space. And as a matter of fact, we have seen there's actually more collaboration across different sectors within the financial space, whether it's the incumbent banks trying to go digital or fintech players who are trying to bridge the gaps. In our case, Ant International operates a solution called Alipay Plus, which is designed to help local mobile payment wallets to scale beyond their country. But in that journey, it can actually be very endearing because when they go into a new country, they need to understand the regulatory landscape and expectations, and not alone some of the emerging risks that we have now seen on the P2P and retail payment space, leveraging tools like QR code payments. So what I want to say is like we need to probably have a more proactive approach, but also more collaborative approach. Recognizing significant efforts actually do require from both public sector and private sector to come together to understand what these emerging technologies, how they can be deployed, what opportunities they can bring from both a policy standpoint, but also a pragmatic standpoint. But more importantly, what are some of the risks these new technology could help to safeguard? Because I think with exponential development on the technology itself, we also see a lot of bad actors trying to get into the space these days. So how can we be 3 steps or 10 steps ahead to hedge against those potential risks which will disrupt the financial stability of the ecosystem that we're building here today? So again, coming from a more APAC ASEAN perspective, we do see, there's actually a lot of initiatives. I think Bank of Thailand is actually one of the forward-thinking regulator in this space. I think there's also a lot of initiatives being announced and launched. And then we expect there's also going to be more roadmaps that will be announced soon down the road. From a Southeast Asia perspective, because we see digital economy is such an important backbone of the development, actually there's actually quite a lot of initiatives that have been pioneered as early as 2016. But the question is why some of these sandboxes are still not as effective as the policymakers want them to be is, I think first, like a lot of these sandboxes are not just cookie cut. They actually have very unique context and national priorities from each country's perspective that needs to be tailored to. And also, once they have this domestic regulatory sandboxing experience, how do they scale beyond and work more regionally? Another aspect that we have seen is almost 90% of the sandbox in the region are focused on product development. So there comes a question, how these product development are actually synced up with the policy objectives that needs to be achieved as an outcome. And then lastly, it's just I think that as Kun Marum just mentioned, I think there's also quite a lot of entry barrier just enter into the sandbox. And then after the sandbox, then what follows? I think that's also another aspect that can be more streamlined and fine-tuned. So from a company perspective, we are currently engaging in 2 regulation sandbox. One is on the privacy enhancing technology, how data insights can be drawn and exchanged to improve the customer's experience. So on that, we're actually working with the Singapore government, IMDA. And throughout that process, it's a very engaging, very intimate relations because we actually bring our data set into that environment, but also throughout the process, walking through the regulator, what that business model looks like, how data is being exchanged, what kind of techniques have been deployed in that environment. And then at the same time, they will tell us what is considered as private privacy data, right? Because that is still a very blurry line. And then more importantly, I think Singapore also has a very global approach where they actually will bring some of these findings and talk to their counterparts in other parts of the world, which as a global company, that is very helpful. So there's like hopefully already some understanding what kind of privacy enhancing technology framework we're looking into, and whether there could be some cross-jurisdictional understanding how that could be applied. So it's still quite at a nascent stage, but we see that kind of public-private dialogue is very encouraging and also give us a bedrock to drive innovation in a much more responsible manner, but also a much more engaging environment where we feel like, we can push the envelope a bit further if we keep the transparency and the communication going. Another sandbox that we are working on is Project Guardian with Monetary Authority of Singapore, examining how tokenized deposit can actually be deployed to enhance the cross-bank and cross-currency efficiency. So that itself, we are also leading an FX working group together with a number of banks to bring actual use case to drive the sandbox. So it's not just a sandbox trial, but with the aim to really drive a real-world use cases. So right now we do see different approach being taken, different sort of environment being created. I don't think there is, again, a cookie cut approach that applies to all. Really depends on what kind of technology we're looking into, what kind of collaboration model we are looking into, but more importantly, how market is viewing that development. How can we bring that business incentive into play to make sure while we are driving that trial, it could be turned into actual application to drive to resolve the market pain points.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Kerry. You raised a wide range of topics there, and interestingly, the national flavour of sandboxes very pertinent when we're going to have a conversation about cross-border, also about scale and then participation. And obviously, we've seen from Widget Laker that they themselves have thought about participation. They've involved how their sandbox operates. And I'd like to come back to those shortly when we talk about sort of the cross-border challenges of sandboxes and what they might be useful for. But you also manage the benefits of you've outlined a very cooperative approach with the Monetary Authority of Singapore, how both sides are learning and sharing information. And Widget Laker, I just wanted to come back to you because I know that there was an initiative in the Bank of Thailand regulatory sandboxes, and I know it's obviously a domestic one, but about QR codes. And I wonder if you could highlight to us, that initiative and what benefits you've seen it bring to the Thai market.
Yes, thank you, Melissa. The QR code for payment was actually one of the first projects entering into our sandbox since 2017. And at that time, the QR code was not really considered to be the new technologies, because QR code was around for many years. But when we started looking at that, because we started having the new standard based on the EMV code to do as the payment, channel for the customers and businesses, and that can engage into the street vendors or even the hypermart stores that can introduce the inclusion on the electronic payments. So, but we encourage and we engage all the financial service providers to test the QR code for payments on the regulatory sandbox, because we want to set up this standard for all the players. As you can see nowadays in Thailand, you can use any mobile banking applications from any top banks to scan with any of the Thai QR code. So it means that you can get the interoperability because when we first started, we send a message to the service providers that Thailand is a small country, so we can't bear the fragmentation. So to imagine of having different, standards of the QR code, and there's a burden for the customers to choose whether, this QR code can be scanned by particular applications. That would not be efficient for a whole financial, system, and is not convenient for the merchant itself and also the customers. So that's a very good approach. And I can share that at first there were some of the big players in the market that didn't actually want to incorporate because they want to have their own closed loop you know cycle and not so open up. So and to kind of lock in their customers and merchants. So and that's not the as Carrie mentioned, I totally agree that the sandbox itself is one of the mechanisms that we can use for the policy implementation as well, because we want to have the open and interoperable infrastructure and not the fragmentation in the market. So that's why we gathered all them to test in the sandbox and have the same standards. And actually, we set up the mutually agreed key success indicators before you can exit the sandbox and provide, because the sandbox is the limited scope of operation, right? So after you success for all the key success indicators, you can meet up with these, and then you can provide a service in the general public. So if the interoperability is one of the key success indicators and you can't achieve it, you can't exit the sandbox. So that's kind of like the mutually agreed key success indicators that we set up for all the projects. And those are the QR code for payment is just one of the examples. Another one that you can see the examples for the sandbox that we leverage on these benefits of the having the infrastructure is we use the biometrics, the facial recognition, which is really, really important because it deals with the sensitive information, personal information, the security and the risk associated with entering into the account or open account by having your identity using it. So all the banks and service providers have to have the same minimum requirements that they have to meet, actually. For example, the accuracy rates that they have to meet, the fault acceptance rate or fault rejection rate, etc. And also how they have to manage the biography and biometric data of the customers. So these are all not only the technology itself that we're looking at, we also look at a whole end-to-end processes that the service providers are doing and the risk associated with in each of the steps, especially the personal data that is sensitive like the biometrics.
Absolutely. No, thank you for sharing that. And you've highlighted obviously some very positive experiences where you've taken a structured approach. You've had a solution you wanted to solve for. You've had rationale for that, like no fragmentation, better harmonization. And I was really interested by the sort of key success indicators to exit the sandbox. That's sort of, there's an end game there. But taking all of those challenges and also the points that Kerry has raised, I'd like to bring it into how could we scale this into a cross-border sandbox. We know there are lots of challenges, and particularly we'll talk about cross-border payments because it's a key topic. And there are two publications just yesterday from the FSB about moving forward on their G20 roadmap, and there's one regarding data frameworks in cross-border payments, and there's another one on regulating and supervising firm for cross-border payments. And I'd be interested, and I'll come to you, Kerry, taking into account the experience, taking into account your lessons learned, taking into account that you are a global company, you operate on a cross-border basis. If you had a little bit of a wish list to say to regulators, this is what I would like to see in a sandbox, what would that wish list be?
Yeah, I'm not complaining. I think there's already progress, being made. I think BIS Innovation Hub is like really inspiring in what they're attempting to achieve. So I think there's already some good practice that is like being rolled out that could be referenced across. I think from an EPA standpoint, there are actually a few observations for regulatory sandbox to be really effective. I think one is from an outset, set a very clear purpose what and why the regulation sandbox is created. And then I think the engagement is very important as well. I think, just borrowing our experience with like Monetary Authority of Singapore, they're very open and meet with the public sector, private sector quite often, just to understand our business model, understand what are the potential bottleneck points, and then how they can help curate the group together. So that's very valuable for us. The reason why we are participating in Project Guardian is also we actually one of the only non-bank, non-FI participant within that sandbox is because we actually drive the actual business use case. And a lot of those partner banks are already our existing partner in the real world. So we actually have good relationship with them. And so that will make the conversation, the sandbox, like much more like smooth and seamless. And then from a regulatory public policy angle, it's very helpful to have clarity around the process, the rules, what are the terms of reference if you get into the sandbox, and then most importantly, what is the legality? Like how do you safeguard the IP being generated from that sandbox itself? And then what are some of the potential options to exit if the interests are not aligned anymore? I think having those very clear principles in place, but also letting market to run a little bit to bring the commercial value on board could make this regulation sandbox very meaningful. And then from there, then also is a very meaningful process for the public sector, because then they understand what are the potential gaps and risk point that needs to be addressed from a policy regulatory aspect. But having said that, it's not always easy, right? Because there's practical challenges. What we see, why some of the sandbox are more successful than the others, because they do have very intensive in-house resource. You actually hire engineers who have run these projects themselves in their past lives, but now they're coming on board and drive this from a public sector perspective. So having that common understanding and language and expertise to facilitate that discussion with the private sector is helpful. And also make sure regulatory sandbox can actually close the potential gap of regulatory arbitrage in the sense that regulator can be seen as not losing their independence. So I think there's actually some balancing exercise that needs to be in place. But so far, the sandboxes that we have been a part of is very positive. I think most importantly, we see there's a lot of willingness for the public sector to also understand how the business model would be deployed and implemented from a private sector perspective. More importantly, I think it's important to understand who are the ultimate customers and beneficiaries that can be included into the business model. Because I was in 0.0 Forum 2 weeks ago, I was in a very heated debate. If traditional players and fintech are already working well together, why do we need Web3? Why do we need distributed technologies to come into play? So I think one thing is important to understand whose problem is that we try to resolve ultimately from a customer standpoint, from a merchant standpoint, and ensure we keep those perspectives into play when we build out the sandbox. Then hopefully we are then moving towards the same direction, to the same policy objectives as well. So I think all these things should be considered carefully.
Thank you. Would you like to
Alicia, sorry, I would like to add more about what Carrie mentioned on
Please.
the policymaker side. Yeah, for the supervision part, the results or the from the sandbox itself, I think is a journey that the public and private sector learn together. But internally, with the supervisory aspects, we actually have to engage the regulatory or supervisory colleagues to join and look at the sandbox as well. because if
Yep.
only the fintech office or the, the business units of the central bank of the sandbox is only looking at it, but actually some of the existing regulations might be the burden for those, emerging technologies, and they probably won't understand because we were like them before we actually conducted a sandbox. So we might as well engage them at the first place, and they understand together with us. And at the end, when you exit the sandbox and those existing regulations can be amended or even can, facilitate you even more when you go to the general public services.
Absolutely. No, thanks for sharing that. I think you've highlighted, and Kerry touched on it, that having a sandbox is actually a whole of regulator activity. It's not just, within the sandbox environment, and it is resource intensive for both parties. I just wanted to, would you like to also ask you about regulating and supervising firms that operate on a cross-border basis, because obviously there are more and more firms that provide these services cross-border. There's obviously been a huge focus, and I go back to the G20 roadmap on cross-border payment. There's obviously firms that operate on a global basis. The consultation that was published did not mention the word sandbox. And obviously there are various initiatives where cross-border challenges have already been addressed in environments that may not be called sandboxes. But if you look at Nexus, if you look at Enbridge, they've brought together regulators and tried to find a mutual solution to a problem. Could you see that a sandbox could somehow help with moving forward the challenges of supervising firms that operate on a cross-border basis?
Yeah, I think it is, but it's really challenging because for the existing sandbox that we're having, I think for all the jurisdictions would be only in the domestic area, right? Because the regulations doesn't cover in the cross-border aspects. So, but the projects that we have in our sandbox, also, for example, the cross-border remittance, the partner of the participating financial service provider was cross-border, but we didn't have them entering into our sandbox. Only the one under our jurisdiction will be in. So you were mentioning about the cross-border sandbox between different jurisdictions. That'd be really interesting, but really challenging as well due to the different regulatory frameworks and also the incentives from the business from both ends.
Absolutely. I think you've both articulated very well that the benefits of sandboxes, even the challenge of domestic sandboxes, but that, there can be real tangible benefits that come out of a sandbox environment. I also see that there can be challenges in trying to put something in place that operates on a cross-border basis. Because obviously there are legal challenges, different jurisdictions, different regulatory focuses, also different regulatory mandates that we haven't even touched upon yet. But ladies, we have just a couple of minutes left. So I'll hand it over to you individually, just to say a few closing words for this session. Kerry, you first.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of good momentum. Obviously G20 FSP is driving tremendous efforts in this conversation. When we joined the FSP cross-border payments task force, we felt there's already a lot of ideas how emerging technologies could be potentially deployed to further the G20 cross-border payments target. I think where we would like to see more is, G20 FSB, they have such a good forum, whether we can leverage that forum to bring the central banks and the supervisory efforts together to look into some of these more promising development technology. And from there, whether we can form some sort of steering committee or working committee focusing on that particular sandbox approach and get buy-in from the key regulators to exchange intel and understanding as a first, but potentially work with BIS Innovation Hub or other kind of like hackathon or like sandbox platforms to really bring some of these technology to the surface.
Thank you very much. And Leka, I am conscious that we have slightly run over, but please do share with us your final thoughts.
Yeah, just a few words here. I think we mentioned about collaboration and also the learning space and sharing the experiences between like regulators and the practitioners. And also the most important thing is the objectives that we set up together, not only the starting the sandbox, but also the key success indicators that we have to set up. And to engage them, they need to have the incentive structure as well, that they have the same interest to enter in, to see the business benefits, and then we can come up with the proper regulatory approach.
Thank you very much. And yes, we didn't even get into the discussion about the incentive structure. But Leka, Kerry, thank you so much for sharing us, thoughts from the regulatory side of the ecosystem, the industry side of the ecosystem. This is obviously a conversation that we could have continued, and I'm sure will be debated in this and other forums. So thank you from me and on behalf of the audience. And Conan, back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Nalixia, for leading us through, a really fascinating view, I think, not just of the global issues of the sandboxes and coordination, but also key views from some important Asia markets as well. So thank you for a great session.